Hey there, listeners. Thought I would give a little note before this podcast with Tim Livingston. I really enjoyed talking to him about his podcast, Whistleblower. If you haven't listened to all of Whistleblower, we don't really spoil anything, but you might enjoy this episode more. If you have listened to all of Whistleblower, you should definitely check it out and listen to the whole thing. It's informative and entertaining. We don't give away too many of the good things. In his podcast, Whistleblower, you will be reminded that there is no question that one, Tim Donaghy bet on games that he was officiating. He absolutely changed the outcomes of games. Two, you might have forgotten there was a massive scandal where refs were selling their first-class airline tickets and pocketing the difference between that and coach. And three, the NBA did some very shady things after the Donaghy scandal to sweep this mess under the table and to extend their TV deals before it all came to light. And a lot of the executives who did that and a lot of the referees who were involved in both the airline scandal, the ticketing scandal, and alleged in the Donaghy scandal, they're all still part of the league, all still part of the NBA. So all those points not up for debate. So I guess if you haven't heard all of Whistleblower, at least know those things before this conversation. And I do want to say, when we were done, when Tim and I were done talking for the podcast, we kept speaking a little bit on the phone, and I told him basically that I think I was a little biased against the idea of an overarching conspiracy because of the few conversations I'd had with Monty McCutcheon. Monty seems so trustworthy and so passionate about refereeing, and the few times I've spoken to him, he seems so trustworthy that maybe that made me biased that there wasn't a conspiracy, and Tim was sympathetic to my my position there. So that's just a little bit of framing for this conversation between me and Tim Livingston. Hope you enjoy it. All right, and welcome to Fast Break Breakfast NBA Podcast. My name is Keith. I'm joined today by Tim Livingston from the incredible Whistleblower podcast series. Tim, how are you?
I'm doing well, Keith. Thanks for having me on.
Excited to have you on. I sent you an email earlier today because we don't know each other, and I sent you an email to let you know that I'm a referee crusader, just to make sure you were aware. I mean, like I said, it'd be a lighthearted conversation, but I'm normally the one on social media and on this podcast where I normally argue in favor of the referees. My basic thesis being their job is impossible. The rules as written don't help them at all. And I think the NBA referees are doing a generally good job doing what they are told to do. So that's like, I guess that's like my thesis statement for referees. But your podcast, it's so entertaining, and it provides a lot of fun color to the Donaghy scandal, which I think most of our listeners know about. So now that I've set the table, I feel more comfortable asking you things. So tell me, how did this come about? I know it took you a long time to do it. So how did it all come about?
So before I hop into the backstory, I will say I agree with everything you said about referees. And I think, I was saying this the other day. Have you ever watched a basketball game or any sport and said, man, that was a great game, and man, the referees called a great game? Because I do that now for the last 5-6 years. Like, I will compliment a well-officiated game before I compliment. Like, LeBron could put in 50, 10 and 10, and Giannis could, have the same stat line. It could go into triple overtime. But you know what? That was an incredibly well-officiated game. So we're on the same page. I love nothing more than seeing a well-refereed game, and I think 90% of them are. It's just unfortunately in the NBA playoffs and finals for the last 30 years, the 10% really stand out and are a huge problem, which we dive into the podcast. But to answer your question, Keith, this story for me, I think it's a lifelong obsession. I grew up playing basketball. It was my favorite sport. I was a little hot-headed point guard, and when I was a kid, I used to curse out referees, much to my mother's dismay. referees I just didn't understand why they couldn't get the calls right. And then I got a little bit older and learned that, all right, well, first off, you're playing a rec league and travel ball and stuff, and they don't want to be there making $10 an hour.
Right, yeah.
If you go up to them and crack a joke and try and endear yourself a little bit, then you start getting calls. And it was kind of that realization early on, okay, these guys are human. And if I humanize their role in all this, then they're going to be more prone to giving me calls. So I think it started as a kid where I was just very cognizant of a referee's influence on a basketball game. And I hated as a kid hearing coaches tell me, the referees you play the game. The referees don't matter. I was always just shocked because I played in games, especially in high school, where I was like, that referee just gave us the game. Or that referee just gave them the game.
Yeah.
Like, referees do matter in basketball. I never understood the logic. And so that's where it started. But with Tim Donaghy, when I was writing as a freelancer for the Post Game, which is a Yahoo site, in 2012, and I wrote an article that I didn't really think that much about. I was probably the same as you and many of your listeners, where I watched basketball games and had bitched and complained about referees for a long time, and just thought that it is an impossible job. But I also thought that there were certain games and certain instances where there was something fishy was going on. Things weren't on the up and up. And so I wrote an article about Tim Donaghy, in which I said, in so many words, Tim Donaghy isn't a good guy, but I believe what he's saying about the NBA. I believe that there's something wrong with the system and that we need to look at the system as a whole and yada, yada, yada. And what happened afterwards is that Tim Donaghy contacted me and thanked me for writing the article. I was the first person to ever say that I didn't think that he was pure evil, essentially. Everything else had just bashed Donaghy, and rightfully so. I mean, he committed sports cardinal sin. I wrote this article that, again, I didn't think that much of it at the time. It was just my opinion on basketball. I just thought basketball, the system that Donaghy described, sounded accurate to me. And that was a system in which referees had a lot of bias towards players, towards coaches, towards owners, and that bias affected how they referee games. And it made the playing field not even, which is a referee's job, is just to create an even playing field, as even of a playing field as is possible to create, given Keith, I know you're a crusader, and it's not easy to do. So yeah, that's where it all started. Donaghy and I met up a year later at Disneyland, which is as bizarre as it sounds. We literally grabbed trays at Goofy's Kitchen. I think Donaghy got a yogurt, and we sat down in a corner, and he proceeded to tell me stories about the NBA and about referees that blew my mind. And I mean, Donaghy, as we get into the podcast, there's a lot that I don't believe that Tim Donaghy says, but when he talks about these other, when he's throwing somebody else under the bus, it's probably true. We've vetted and corroborated with as high up as the FBI, and he's got nothing to lose by telling the truth about these other referees and how they officiated and how backwards it was in that era. And that's where this all started. I originally thought about doing a documentary. Then I heard Serial, and I was like, wait a minute, Donaghy's story, this is Serial for sports. Like, this is the perfect podcasting. It's the perfect format to tell the story. And then it only took me 6 years to get off the ground. And so here we are today.
It's not bad. Yeah. So Donaghy, as everyone knows, and he's admitted, like, he was betting on games. He was betting on games that he refereed and definitely influenced the outcomes of games, even though I think he kind of claims that he didn't do that. But he did these things, but when the case was, when they were coming at him, and when this was exposed, and then the FBI was building a case, the NBA basically shut it down because they didn't want Donaghy to take the stand, basically. The NBA wanted to kind of wrap this up as quickly as possible for obvious reasons. It was very damaging to their multi-billion-dollar brand. So what do you think was going to be like the most damaging thing that Donaghy would allege on the stand? Like, what was the primary reason the NBA was like, we need to make this go away as quickly, and quietly as possible?
That's a great question. There are so many things. If you read, again, Donaghy, I don't want to promote Donaghy's book on your podcast, but
it's fine. My listeners don't read.
It is. Okay, good. Okay. So I can give you the highlights. what Donaghy describes is a system that we describe in the podcast and analyze in great depth. But he says that the NBA and its referees had an understanding. And that understanding was that get the big market teams in the finals, right? Do what you have to do to make sure the Lakers in the finals. And the NBA can deny this. And again, we haven't heard from Adam Silver yet. I envision at some point that will happen. Maybe the NBA will be able to skirt this forever. I don't know. But the NBA can deny that's the case. But when David Stern says publicly that his dream NBA finals is the Lakers versus the Lakers, I mean, even that's where this gets a little murky, right? It's like, how can that not influence a referee's thought process? In, they have an impossible job to begin with. If it's a block charge call where the block and the Lakers advance to the finals and a charge, the Kings, the Blazers advance, how does that not influence that referee's thinking in real time, right? And maybe, referees are robots and aren't human. And we could argue that, anything said, like they're so good at their job, they're so diligent that's unaffected. I don't think that's the case, Keith. So basically with Donaghy, the most damning thing that Donaghy said is that there was a system in place that referees understood implicitly which teams needed to advance the finals. And so if you look at the most controversial games in NBA history, and we quote a Bill Simmons article from 2002, which looked at the most controversial games just from 2000 to 2002, because that was bad. There was a bunch of really bad games and series in that era. The Bucks losing to the Sixers in the Eastern Conference Finals in 2001, the Lakers-Kings series, the Lakers-Blazers series, just a bunch of really bad series that where the officiating was worse than guys just having a bad game or being tasked with a near impossible job. And so Donaghy, that was the biggest thing that Donaghy said. So if he were in court talking about this, right, and he was getting cross-examined by his attorney who could set him up with specific questions, and if Donaghy came across a credible witness with credible testimony to this idea that the NBA had a system in place that essentially assured that big market teams and big market stars advanced the NBA finals over small market teams, then, what at that point, what is the NBA? It's wrestling. And that's the biggest thing. But man, the NBA was, as we exposed in the podcast, this was a cover-up. I divide this into two things. As you implied, there's a scandal. There's what Tim Donaghy was doing on the court. There's the games that he was refereeing and betting on. And there was 260 games that he alone refereed from 03 to 07 at the height of the scheme. So that's 260 NBA basketball games that were being manipulated in some form by one of the referees in the court. That's bad. But then you look at the conspiracy. And the conspiracy is what Donaghy alleges. What was the NBA doing at this time? What was David Stern doing at this time? What was the NBA doing to police its police? And those are really the answers that we found, and the questions that we're proposing are really disturbing for basketball fans. And I know this is a lighthearted podcast, Keith, so I'll try and bring it back before we get too dark.
No, we like going dark too. It's fine.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, that's really, as basketball fans, we want a meritocracy. We want the best team to always win the NBA Finals. And do we believe that every year? Most years, yeah. 90% of the time, I think the best team wins the Finals. But is that good enough? Hell no. The best team, if 10% of the time the best team doesn't win the championship, that's a travesty for a sports fan. And so that's where we're at, and that's what I think as basketball fans we need to demand of the NBA, is that the best team wins the finals every year. And referees make mistakes. They're human. It's a really hard job. The system's gotten better. If you notice, like in that era, you knew every single NBA referee. You knew Dick Pavetta, you knew Jabby, you knew Crawford. You knew all these guys. You recognized them. Today, you recognize far less referees, and that's a good thing. That means they're doing their job. It's a really, really, really hard job. Your job is to get booed by 20,000 people every single night. If you do the best work of your life, nobody notices. You get zero accolades. Your job is to be invisible. It's a very, very strange vocation. And so with that being said, the fact that now in today's NBA, we notice less referees, they're less noticeable. That means they're doing a better job. I think the game is the officiating is far, far better than it was during this era. But during this era, it was really bad. And today, it's gotten better, but Scott Foster is still refereeing games. And Scott Foster still hasn't answered questions about his relationship with Tim Donaghy and his potential involvement in this scandal. He exchanged 134 phone calls with Tim Donaghy on the phone that the FBI says Donaghy is using for gambling. And why is Scott Foster? I'm supposed to trust Scott Foster to referee a finals game? Are you kidding me? I don't trust Scott Foster to do anything.
The Scott Foster thing is so strange. If I were a defense attorney and I wanted to argue like Tim Donaghy is a super mastermind, or even the prosecutor, or say like if I'm defending Scott Foster, I could say this mastermind Tim Donaghy, he called my guy all the time, so it looks suspicious. Scott Foster's like, why does Tim keep calling me? This is strange. But no, the one thing that Donaghy raises and that you focus on in your podcast, I thought was really interesting that I hadn't considered, and is almost, you could imagine it in like a comical scenario, is like Donaghy says there was an understanding. I think it's funny to imagine, what if Donaghy was misreading like the signals the league was giving him? Like you didn't want me to whack that guy? Like in a black comedy or something, where it's like, no. We didn't say put Shaq in the finals. We were saying, look out for these things. And we actually meant it. And so like that goes to this, the well-known, the Kings-Lakers series where there's this game 6 that everyone's talked about. And people on Reddit have tried to go through all the calls and been like, I don't think it's a conspiracy. There's a lot of calls that are tossed up. So like, as team ref guy over here, something I hadn't considered until I heard your podcast, when he talks a lot about the officials' meetings. And I've spoken to Monty McCutcheon on this show a couple times, and he's talked about how like the day of every NBA game, the referees have a meeting to go over like that night's game. And so it's interesting to me, and something I hadn't considered before, like a plausible explanation for me, probably not for Kings fans, a plausible explanation for me, it's like after game 5 of that Kings-Lakers series, game 5 where Shaq fouls out and only shoots one free throw, that it's possible on the day of game 6, the referee supervisor is going over the film with the referees for game 6 and saying, hey, we actually did miss some calls in game 5. Scott Pollard shoving Shaq here. That's a foul. We got to clean this up. Divac shoving Shaq here. We got to clean that up. And so because of that, maybe they went into that game with a mindset, we do need to fix these things. And the thing I never considered before, like, is that equitable? Like, is that fair by the league to do these things? Or is that a way of like the NBA trying to balance power? So or to extend a series. So I could imagine both ways. The NBA arguing, we were just highlighting things we actually missed. And maybe a guy like Donaghy or Bavetta is like, I'm reading you loud and clear. The Lakers will take care of the Lakers.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Donaghy is he only refereed. He was still a relatively junior ref. So he wasn't refereeing. I don't think he ever refereed a conference finals. I know he never refereed a finals game. He refereed a handful of playoff games, but I don't think he advanced to the conference final. Like, he wasn't reffing the big games. And the image of him misconstruing information and like maybe inadvertently propelling the Kings to a championship or something is really funny. That probably, he was. I don't think Tim was shying away from imbibing at this time, so that could have easily happened. But I think to your point with talking to Monty McCutcheon and other officials, and like, yeah, there's the argument that referees are communicated with before every game to make them, do the best job possible. But that's never really made sense to me. The rules are the rules. And that's where Mark Cuban comes into play. Mm-hmm. Mark Cuban, all he's wanted since he joined the league in 2000 was the rule to be the rule. So if a guy takes 3 steps, it's a travel. If the guy cups, a carry's a carry, a charge is a charge, and a block's a block, it's impossible to get everyone right. These guys are the best athletes on the planet. They're moving at warp speed, and you're not going to get every call right. But by definition, a call is a call. So why on earth does the NBA need to communicate with referees before the game in any way, right? Like, the NBA should be totally separate. And this is what we're arguing. This is where we can actually improve the system. The NBA doesn't need to be involved with referees at all. What if referees were employed by a separate entity that wasn't, what if their playoff bonus checks weren't subject to the NBA assigning them those games? Because that's the system in place. And if you look at, a referee's job and how a referee makes money, they make so much money every single year off working playoffs and finals games. Those are their bonuses. They, for example, if a referee is making, these are estimates, but if a referee makes $200,000 or $250,000 a year, they can make an additional $150,000 to $200,000 refereeing playoffs and finals games. So they want those games. Those games are very important to them, and the NBA assigns those games. And what Donaghy says is that it was well known, if you wanted to be Dick Pavetta, if you wanted to work more playoff and finals games than anyone else, then you had to referee a certain way. You had to make sure that the Lakers won. You had to make sure the Knicks won. You had to make sure that the best result for TV ratings was produced. And you can say that Dick Pavetta was a great ref, but Dick Pavetta refereed, if you look at the most controversial games in NBA history, Dick Pavetta was refereeing a lot of them. And refereeing is a hard job, but the fouls that he missed, the calls that he called in an era before replay and before you could, reverse a call, were really, really, really bad. And so I think this is maybe what you're hinting at, Keith, the subjectivity of refereeing as a, it's so subjective, right? It is and it always will be. So there is absolute, if you're a prosecutor, if you're the NBA and you have the best defense attorneys in the world, which they would, there's the ability to say that, hey, these guys just missed a bunch of calls and you're making a big deal out of nothing. Of course. I just personally, after doing this investigation and looking at all the different variables at play, I don't believe that to be the case. I believe that there was motivation behind calls in big games and that referees were making those calls to continue working playoffs and finals games, and that David Stern knew all this and perpetuated this fraud. And it's really disturbing to me as a basketball fan, and for anybody who's listened to the podcast or will listen to the podcast, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because it's certainly, for me as a sports fan, the NBA's actions over the course of this era, of the David Stern era, are so incredibly disturbing. So, did you feel, I'll turn into interviewer now, Keith. Did you feel that way after listening to the podcast? Did you feel like you've been jobbed a little bit as a basketball fan?
So it's interesting, like you raised so many interesting questions, and when you interviewing like the bookies and the mafia guys who are saying that we had multiple referees working with us and we know Donaghy was affecting games. So, like, I recognize that those, that was a problem and those guys were changing games. As far as like the idea of the NBA trying to guide it more like professional wrestling to get like the best teams, like I'm not there yet. There's too many examples of like, well, like why didn't this team win? I'm not saying like I don't believe it at all, but I'm still more of a skeptic. Also because like I maybe I don't have as much like faith in it's weird. Like I think the refs are really, really good, but the idea that they could be doing these things and not be detected, I don't trust that as much. And like even the Kings series, even if they did force a Game 7, Peja Stojakovic missed a wide open 3-pointer in Game 7. Like my biggest takeaway from the Kings-Lakers series was, wow, I don't want Peja Stojakovic taking a clutch 3-pointer. Like he airballed it by 4 feet. It seemed like maybe he was on the take or something. Like, so like, even if they are directing the series, like let's try to extend the series, I don't feel like, I guess I'm still unconvinced. And I'm interested in like Mark Cuban. So like the one thing that I thought was, to me, and maybe I heard it wrong because I was washing dishes while I was listening, the one thing I felt that I seemed like misrepresented to me on Whistleblower was when you're talking about the Rockets Mavs series with Yao Ming. Was it 2005? I'm looking. Yeah, I think 2005.
Yeah, it was 2005.
So the Mavs get down 0-2. They're down 0-2 in the series. Cuban, he sends tapes, like the Mavs send tapes to the referees to say like, you guys aren't refereeing this correctly, you're missing calls. And so the referees then have their supervisor do their regular daily meeting that they do before every NBA game, regular season and postseason. And the officials, the referee supervisor tells the refs, hey, we are missing these calls on Yao Ming. This is going to be refereed differently. And it seems like the way it's presented on Whistleblower, you felt like it was kind of nefarious of the league to do that. And then a referee informed Jeff Van Gundy, who was coaching the Rockets and Yao Ming at the time, that, hey, we're going to call this a little bit differently. We've noticed that we've been missing calls. And to me, that felt like, well, that's like the equitable thing to do. Or like that's the proper sportsmanship thing to do, is to say, we have, in fact, identified if we've missed these calls. And our process, and you might disagree that this is a wrong process, but our process is we're going to try to adjust these things, and we're letting you know ahead of this game we're going to change stuff. So, like, what's your rebuttal like? Or did I misinterpret the way that was set up?
Yeah, I think nefarious is a strong word, but
okay.
I'll talk about the Cuban Rockets thing, because what we're doing in that is we're just looking at the system, right?
Sure.
That was the eye-opening thing to be like, all right, so if Donnie Vaden, who's the referee supervisor, says to the referees, like, hey, you have to look out for Yao Ming and move. And by the way, Yao Ming, I watched the first couple of games of that series. Yeah, Yao Ming was definitely shuffling his feet on screens. And the NBA it's totally fine that they corrected it. It's really just about looking at the system. Because Mark Cuban, by pointing that out, the Rockets usually would not be informed, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
Hey, Yao Ming is the problem. Again, it goes to the subjectivity of refereeing. If Yao Ming, if you're letting him do that the first two games, you make a sudden change in game three. Well, then, okay, so what is the rule, right? What is Yao Ming actually allowed to do? How is he permitted to set screens if this is the precedent that's been set, and now all of a sudden he's being penalized for doing exactly what he was doing? So, I mean, Cuban was absolutely right to do that, because that's the system in place. I have no qualms with Mark Cuban doing what he did. For me, that segment of the podcast was just to open up your eyes and say, like, is this right? Is this the right system? Should an owner be able to send a tape to the league, and the league, because the owner sent a tape to the league, directly communicate to its officials to change the way they're officiating the series? And in this case, I think they were right. I think Yao Ming was shuffling his feet, and I think it should have been enforced more. But okay, so the Rockets end up losing that series, and that's fine. I mean, that series was pretty inconsequential in the scope of everything that we looked at. And in that case, you could argue, Keith, that the system worked. But again, the system as a whole, is that really what we want as a system? Do we really want the NBA to have a direct line of communication with the officials in the middle of a playoff series? And if we allow that, is there not room for manipulation, right? Because what you're saying is that almost every game is refereed as well as it can be by guys and gals doing the best job that they can. And I agree with that. I think a vast majority of NBA games are officiated on the up and up, and as well as they can be. But if any game is subject to manipulation, whether it's 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10, that's a problem. And that's what we're looking at is a system in which the NBA has a direct line of communication with its referees, in my opinion, is in a very easily manipulated system. So that's what we're looking at is how do we improve the system? Because there is a call to action in the podcast, which is referees employed by separate. There's a clear thing that we can do to make a lot of these questions go away. It's not going to happen tomorrow. That would be a complicated overhaul, but it's something that we can do as fans to really to have more trust in the integrity of the game. Well, I want to go back to the thing that you said about being able to detect a referee fixing games.
Yeah.
Tim Donaghy was one of the highest rated officials in the year at the peak of this scheme, because he was calling technically correct calls that most referees don't call. And so the guys grading Tim Donaghy were like, oh yeah, this guy's doing great. This guy's making all the right calls. Look at this guy. Look at this guy go. Great referee. Right. But he was fixing games. I think we make it pretty clear. There's one thing that I think we proved pretty definitively. It's that Tim was manipulating basketball games, for his own personal financial gain. And if you think that the NBA can detect anything in that regard regarding referees manipulating basketball games, I would say you're absolutely wrong. I think there's absolutely no way for them to detect this. And if you listen to, like you said, Michael Franzese, one of the mobster, former Colombo capo, a very, very renowned mobster, a brilliant businessman mobster, if that's a thing. So what Franzese said is that fixing a basketball game wasn't it wasn't hard. It was easy and undetectable. And that's a problem. We really need to have trust. Because I would argue that we could watch a game and it could be manipulated or fixed against the spread, right? A team that was supposed to win by 10 points could win by 6. And we as fans don't know the difference, but that's still bad. Something bad just happened. And then further on in the playoffs and finals, it's like game 3 of the finals where Anthony Davis picks up a couple of quick fouls on somewhat controversial charges. And, you got Lakers fans saying, oh, this is the NBA, it's usual BS. I mean, how do we know if that's nefarious or not? How do we know whether the NBA had motive? I don't think it did. But I think the problem is that we can continue to poke holes in the system. And again, I think the integrity of basketball, I don't trust the NBA to protect that. And I guess you do a lot more than I do. But I would encourage you to really think about all the factors at play. I don't. So it's a fun argument to have because you make some really good points. But ultimately, it seems like you are, for the most part, you believe that the NBA wants every single game to be officiated to the best it can be without any care about who wins. And I think that's mostly true, but I don't think it's 100% true.
I'm with you there. I think I'm generally of the opinion that the NBA is training these guys to do the best job they can. And I agree with you. There's so many things about the system I would be in favor of changing. And again, one of my favorite parts about the podcast is envisioning how Donaghy says, fix a game by only making the correct calls, just choosing which correct calls you want to make and selectively enforcing the rules. And I love that. I have the tiniest experience of refereeing at the high school level. And that appealed to me. I was like, that's pretty neat. And I can see that. If you are going to redo the system and you make this plea they should be independent so they can't be manipulated, my wonder would be, how would an independent referee organization be financially independent enough to not be to not have to do whatever it takes to keep the contract with the league, or to not be under the influence of perhaps outside forces like gambling or, the mob or whoever's making the bets?
That's a great question. I think with somebody as smart as Mark Cuban leading the way, that we could figure out a model that makes sense. One thing, so as part of that, I think what you need referees to open up their checkbooks, right? You need forensic analysis of their finances at all times. Until you have that, with Scott Foster, I don't know if Scott Foster were to say, I didn't know what Tim Donaghy was doing. He was calling me all the time, trying to glean information. I'm the victim here. I'm going to open up my finances for this entire era. I'm going to open up my wife's finances. Take a look. My money is exactly what the NBA was paying me and nothing more. And at that point, that would exonerate Scott Foster. With today's NBA and with the system in place, with how much money is moving in betting right now, and with the legalization of sports betting, and with, it's $100-200 billion market. And right now, I think only 2 or 3% of that is legal. So this market and the amount of money to be made in fixing games for a referee, the top ones like Foster are making close to $1 million a year, but the junior ones aren't making that. And I don't want to stereotype referees, but I know a lot of their backgrounds, and there's a lot of kind of Tim Donaghy-esque guys that are of that ilk, former athletes, the chip on their shoulder, and who might not, be able to resist the temptations of falling into this world over the course of their entire careers. And right now we don't police referees at all. And with the power that they have over the game, at the NBA and basketball being such a unique sport, all I'm saying is that we need to police our police in order to protect the integrity and the sanctity of our game that we all love. And so as far as that system goes, I think you raised a really good question. I don't have a concrete model for how it would remain independent enough. First off, just a little bit of independence goes a long way. But to your point, if referees still know, they know the secret's out at this point. that the Lakers in the finals makes more money than the Kings in the finals. Unless the Kings acquire Giannis and LeBron and Michael Jordan comes back, in which case, again, because it's not just about markets, it's about marketability. Like the Bucks are a small market team, but with Giannis, the NBA, I think, would be totally fine with him making the NBA finals. So, yeah, I think you raised a really good question. That'll be fun. Keith, when Mark Cuban finally gets to do this, why don't we, get put on the board or whatever?
Man, I would love to. I honestly, the couple times I've talked to Monty McCutcheon, I'm like, you guys need PR help. You could can I give you some names? Like you need like people with a sense of humor to do your social media. You got to get Steve Javie off the broadcasts. Like, come on, you're killing it. No, if you could, if you could ask Mark Cuban one thing that he would answer you truthfully, because it seems like, he's in a weird spot. He's got his golden goose, the league, that's making him tons of money, but he also wants to fix the referees thing, and maybe he knows stuff about Donaghy and Scott Foster and Bavetta and other guys. If there was one question you could ask Cuban that he would answer truthfully, what would that be?
Great question, because there are 1,000 questions, but I think the big one is when Tim Donaghy came out and said what he said about the NBA, did you believe him? I would love to hear Mark Cuban give me a yes or no answer on that, because I think the answer is yes. I think when Tim Donaghy came out and made the allegations that he made against the NBA and exposed, again, he's not credible, right? Like he had just committed a major, major crime and had proven that he's not a trustworthy individual. Well, when Donaghy came out and said, hey, this is how the NBA works, at least from a referee standpoint. This is, I've worked with Bavetta and Crawford and Javi and all these guys, and this is how they operate and how we're trained to think. I would just want to hear if Mark Cuban believes that, because I think he'd be lying if he said that he didn't believe any of it, right? I think not only did he believe some of it, I think he believed all of it. So I'd love to hear Mark answer that question. I hope he does someday. I mean, I love Mark Cuban. I have a ton of respect for Mark Cuban. I think he's a great guy. I mean, I've never met him in person, but I think my wife has. She says he's a nice guy. So there you go, Keith. We're good. I mean, Cuban is, I think he's all about integrity. And I think he wants the game to be an even playing field. I think that's what he's wanted since he entered the league in 2000. I think if you listen to Tim Cowenshaw and the different Dallas area folks that we interview, I never say folks. I guess just when I'm talking about Dallas, it's not part of my normal nomenclature, so I apologize. But I think if you listen, that's all Mark Cuban's ever wanted. And I think he's railed against referees for so long and so passionately because he doesn't believe that the system in place is the best possible system. I think if you gave Mark Cuban the keys tomorrow to architect a new blueprint for the NBA and its officials, I think I know he's got it in his brain. So the question you just asked me is probably better posed to him, but I think Mark could do an incredible job and do incredible things if he were allowed to, form. Look, here's the Adam Silver playbook. Let Mark Cuban form a new committee that is, tasked with, put it on Mark Cuban, Adam. You don't have to do it. Make Mark the committee. It's like the NFL does. These guys, all the NFL owners are part of various committees. Give Mark that ability to architect a new system and see what he comes up with. Because I guarantee you that it's going to be a hell of a lot better than the one in place currently. It's
not like Mark Cuban has a dog in the fight, though. That might be a little. Might be a little awkward.
That the Mavericks have to shoot a minimum of
That's
40
right.
free throws.
That's right. Luke is getting a lot of calls right now. No, yeah. Now this is great. Last question. People will be mad if I don't ask. We always talk about breakfast. What is your breakfast order? Say you're at a diner. Say you're waiting to meet with former federal agent Phil Scala to talk corruption. What's your diner breakfast order?
Oh, so good. I'm two things depending on mood: corned beef hash or huevos rancheros.
Oh yeah, so good. Those are both.
Boom. And I love breakfast. Nice. My wife and I, we make breakfast for dinner once a week.
Well, there you go.
You're talking the right. If your listenership, if saying corned beef hash instead of just eggs over easy is a way to endear myself to to everybody listening to this right now, then yeah, let's all grab breakfast.
Let's all grab breakfast.
I'm all about it.
We can discuss how the league screwed up by not having a Lakers-Clippers Western Conference Finals. Some ref dropped the ball.
Big miss.
Little misunderstanding. No, man. Hey, I look forward to whatever's coming next from you. All listeners, obviously, go listen to Whistleblower. Maybe do you have like a Netflix series in the works where it's like a fictional thing about dirty refs? I feel like that'd be great. Like Copland, but with referees. They all live in the same town, Delaware County. Getting in all kinds of, high on uppers, blowing through toll booths.
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, we're going to use you saying that in whatever we pitch to Netflix. That's for sure.
Good.
My buddy Gabe Spitzer's listening right now.
That's right.
Gabe, let's go. Green
like
that tomorrow.
Copland, but with referees. Make it happen. Anyway, Tim.
Sold. I got a budget I need. It's a lot of zeros. I need what Tim Donaghy is getting paid to referee games.
Yeah. I think Tim's available if you need it to do some work. Donaghy, that is.
I hope so. I hope so. I think so.
Anyway, hey, Tim, thanks so much for your time, and hopefully we can speak again soon sometime.
Appreciate it, Keith.
All right, thanks to Tim for coming on. Really fun conversation. I hope to talk more about this topic with him some point in the future. One thing I forgot to mention that I wish I brought up, and it's something that's not mentioned in Whistleblower. In that famous Game 6 between the Kings and the Lakers, where alleged company man Dick Bavetta was reffing, one of the other refs on the court then was Bob Delaney. And look up Bob Delaney. Bob Delaney was a referee who, before he was a referee, was a state trooper who went undercover and infiltrated the mob. So I kind of wish I'd asked him if he'd heard anything that was on the cutting room floor for Whistleblower about that. But thanks for listening. If you want to support our show, you can do that at patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. We're getting geared up for fantasy basketball over there. So if you want to play in one of our fantasy basketball leagues, like the iShop Negative Fantasy League, make sure you're signed up at the $5 a month tier. Patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. Anyway, you guys are the best. Thanks for listening. And remember, breakfast is the most important thing.
Yeah, never apologize for being G&G. Fast break, man. You understand?